Hello there, and welcome to the Podshop, your comprehensive guide to B2B branded podcasting. I'm Jeremy Shear, and in this episode, we're going to look at why some branded podcasts fail and how you can avoid the mistakes that result in failure and set your show up for success. So if you're on the fence about starting a branded podcast in 2023, I totally understand, because it's pretty easy to get a podcast started, but it's much harder to keep it going. And you definitely don't want to put a lot of time and effort into starting a show only to see it die on the vine after only a handful of episodes. That's a bad look for your company, and it's a bad look for you. But maybe it is worth giving podcasting a shot, because if you go about it the right way and you avoid the mistakes that doom some shows to failure, a branded podcast can be a really powerful weapon in your content marketing arsenal. And it can bolster your reputation and your company's reputation as an industry leader. So in this segment, I'll break down the most common reasons why branded podcasts sometimes fail, and how you can avoid the mistakes that lead to failure and make the moves that result in branded podcasting success. So I'll cover the following: having unrealistic goals and what realistic goals look like, focusing your show too broadly and how to find the right niche, choosing the wrong name for your show and tips for finding the right name, getting stuck with the wrong host and how to find the right host, and finally, failing to publish consistently and how to stick to a publication schedule. All right, ready? Let's go. So reason number one, having unrealistic goals. To succeed with a branded podcast, you need to know what success looks like. And given the eye-popping numbers associated with some podcasts, it's easy to get the wrong idea. So, for example, the Joe Rogan Experience, which is the consensus most successful podcast in the world, gets around 11 million listeners or viewers per episode. But unlike podcasts meant for general consumption and designed to reach the largest possible audience, a B2B branded podcast is a niche product meant to engage a very specific audience. Also consider that the number of listeners you gain is only a part of measuring podcasting success. There are also the relationships you create with your guests, and there's the content you create by repurposing podcast episodes as video clips and as written content. So the solution here is to have realistic goals. So, for example, a realistic set of goals may look something like this: publishing new episodes consistently for 1 year, turning every episode into at least 3 pieces of content, getting at least 50 downloads per episode within the first 6 months, and converting at least 2 podcast guests into customers. Now, your goals may look different and they may change over time, but the point is that starting with realistic and achievable goals is crucial for setting your show up to succeed. Reason number 2, failing to distinguish your branded podcast. Now, one of the biggest challenges facing content marketers is cutting through the noise, because as content marketers are quick to lament, there's too much content out there already. And that's true. There's a ton of B2B content cluttering up the interwebs, and most of it is pretty forgettable. So if your podcast covers the same ground already covered by other podcasts, if you use the same format, adopt the same tone, and you don't have a particular point of view, well, then your show is just going to get lost in that dreaded sea of sameness, and it's going to fail to really engage your audience. The solution, of course, is to distinguish your show from what's already out there. And the first step is to search on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or wherever you get podcasts, to search there for shows in your industry. So sticking with the example from before, let's say that you start a podcast about the supply chain industry and you're aimed at an audience of people who are VPs of supply chain. So your first step is to take a look at which podcasts out there are focused on supply chain stuff and do a bit of a deep dive to see which topics they cover, how they approach them, and what sorts of guests they have on to discuss these issues. Now, your purpose is to find a way to differentiate your show. And you might find opportunities to focus on a particular part or parts of the supply chain, or perhaps you can feature guests who don't normally get to share their views. Arguably, the best way to make your show stand out is to channel it through the lens of your organization's particular point of view. I mean, what's your company's reason for existing? How do you think about supply chain issues in ways that are different from your competitors? Where do you stand on the most important issues facing the industry? Focus your podcast on your company's unique point of view, and you'll have a show that stands out and that offers your audience something new and unique. Reason number 3, choosing a weak name. Now, the biggest mistake B2B brands make when choosing a podcast name is naming the show after themselves. So, for example, I might have called our podcast about branded podcasting Conversa Conversations or something like that. But that's a weak name because it has zero SEO value. And that's because B2B marketers looking for podcasts about branded podcasting are not going to search for Conversa or Conversa Conversations. So here's another example. My podcast about B2B content marketing was originally called Engage Your Tribe, which wasn't a terrible name, but it wasn't great either because according to SEO data, B2B marketers aren't looking for podcasts using terms like audience engagement or engage your tribe. The search volume for keywords like B2B content, B2B marketing, and B2B content marketing is much higher. And so I changed the name of the show to the B2B Content Show. And it's resulted in the show gaining more listeners because it's easier to find in podcast directories. So the takeaway is that the name you give your podcast should map directly onto what your audience is actually looking for. If your show, for example, is about motivating sales teams, the name of the show should probably include the words sales and motivation or close synonyms. Choosing this sort of straightforward name will also make it easier to recruit high-quality guests. People you invite will be much more likely to accept if they can see at a glance that the podcast is a good fit for who they are and what they do. If I'm a sales leader whose job it is to motivate and train my sales team, being invited to be on a show called The Sales Motivation Show would make immediate sense, whereas being invited to be on a show with a more obscure name like, like The Motivator or Motivationally Speaking or something like that, it might not seem like such an obvious fit, and I might be less inclined to give you my time and be a guest on your show. Reason number 4, getting stuck with the wrong host. Now, the person or people who hosts your show are crucially important to its success because they're going to be the most consistent voice, they're going to bring the energy, they're going to be the one getting the content and drawing out the guests that you have on the show. But, it's all too easy to get stuck with the wrong host or with a bad host by handing off hosting duties to the first person who raises their hand and volunteers. Now, that person may be really enthusiastic, they may be a big podcast fan, but that doesn't mean that they're the best choice for hosting your show. But if they do end up being the host, it can become a big problem if they turn out to be stiff and wooden, or they talk too much, or are just generally low energy and boring. Because depending on your organization's culture, once you give somebody that opportunity to be the host, they might want to give it up, and replacing them might cause hard feelings or even resentment. So the solution here is to choose a strong podcast host from the beginning. And to do that, first you have to know what you're looking for. So you want someone who's energetic and has an outgoing personality. You want someone who's good at conversation and good at drawing people out. You want someone who's comfortable doing more listening than talking. And, of course, you want someone who's knowledgeable enough about the industry to have an in-depth conversation with a subject matter expert. The only way to really know if a host is going to work out is to give them a shot and see how it goes. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have multiple people who you think would be good hosts, we'll try them out for a few episodes before promising anyone the position. You might end up going with co-hosts or with 2 or 3 hosts who can trade off episodes. Reason number 5, failing to publish consistently. Now, there's an argument for actually making this the first reason on the list because publishing consistently is arguably the single most important factor for success with podcasting. But why is consistently such a big deal? Imagine that you've subscribed to a podcast that's supposed to come out with new episodes every Wednesday. Wednesday comes, but there's no new episode. Instead, it's published the next week, on Friday. If this continues and you're never really sure when the next episode is going to come out, then there's a good chance you'll just lose interest and move on. Now, inconsistency is also a problem because it makes the show look unprofessional, which in turn makes it harder to get guests. When a potential guest sees that the episodes are published erratically, they're just going to be less likely to take it seriously and spend time on the show and give you their time being a guest. Now, the solution here is to publish consistently, and really that's a twofold solution. The first part is to create a publication schedule, and that can just be a simple spreadsheet with dates for prep calls, recording, and publishing. And of course, you need to stick to that schedule. And the second part is to always be working at least 1 episode ahead. So before launching your show, you should have at least 5 episodes in the can. 3 that you'll publish when you launch the show, and then 2 more that are ready to go. And that's going to give you time to record and produce the next episode without having to rush at the last minute. So, summing up, the keys to success with branded podcasting include setting realistic goals, finding a niche for your show, choosing the right name, finding a strong host, and publishing consistently. With those elements in place, your podcast will start off on a firm foundation, and you'll be giving it every chance to succeed. So if you have any questions about having success with B2B branded podcasting, don't hesitate to be in touch. You can contact me on LinkedIn. You can learn more on our website at conversa.com, or you can email me at jeremy@conversa.com. That's Conversa with 2 N's. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.